Good evening, and welcome to What's Your Story? I'm your host, James Ransom Reed, Jr. As we travel throughout life, we all encounter extraordinary people. The surprising thing is often how ordinary they are. That's why my show is called What's Your Story? I believe ordinary people have extraordinary stories. And I believe that that idea will be realized tonight with my guest. So I encourage you to sit back, relax, and enjoy a two-part segment with my very, very special guest, Laurencia Ciprus, who will tell her story. Perhaps in her story, you can find your own. Welcome to the show, Laurencia.
Good afternoon, James. So happy to be here. Thank you for your time.
It's so good to see you.
You too.
Absolutely. You are looking marvelous.
Thank you, dear. So are you.
There you go. You know, I like to get the audience acquainted with my guests. So would you please give us an overview of your background? Like, where were you born?
I was born in Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford, Connecticut, Hartford girl. My mother grew up in Hartford in the North End, and my grandparents as well lived there. First home was on Albany Avenue, so the heart of Hartford. And I watched it change and evolve over time. Then we moved to Bloomfield.
Yes.
With my grandparents after my mom and dad split when I was really tiny. And I went to the Blue Hill School. It was a wonderful place to grow up. I loved it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, where did you attend grade school?
I went to the Blue Hill School, which was sandwiched between Rockwell Avenue and Cottage Grove Road, and I was able to walk to school, and you could hear the cows at night from Capaco.
Is that right?
It's right. It was rural. It was very rural there, and we were right on the edge of Hartford.
You know, I heard about that, the cows at Capaco, and I know they had a symbol there for a while of a cow, and I never knew that that was real, that really happened.
It was very real. There was a petting zoo there, and at night when the windows were open, before we had air conditioning, you could hear the animals at night. It was great.
My goodness. Who the individual that had the greatest impact on your childhood?
Oh, that's really easy. Jim, my grandfather, Philip Horowitz, he was an immigrant from Lithuania fleeing the Bolsheviks. And he came to this country speaking multiple languages. He must have been about only 14 years old when he came over by boat.
Yes.
And he spoke so many languages and was so congenial that they didn't keep him in steerage. They had him as an interpreter up on deck. So he was a very limitless person. He had incredible vision and vista. He came to the United States. He was a model for Hart, Shafter, and Marks when he landed in Chicago.
Well, tell the audience what that is.
Hart, Shafter, and Marks was one of the early menswear companies, and he ended up being a model. He was a suit model.
Wow.
And he was amazing. He met my grandmother at a dance. He saw her cross the room, one of those when Harry met Sally moments, and he said, I'm going to marry that woman. And he did.
Wow.
And she was born in 1900 on a dairy farm in New Britain, Connecticut. And and they were together for, God, like over 55 years.
Wow.
So it was a really great way to grow up. But my grandfather was so much fun. He was so amazing. He was so visionary. He chased Pancho Villa on horseback during the Mexican border uprising. I still have his harmonicas and his army manual.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite a story in and of itself, isn't it?
It really, really is. And he'd had a dishonorable discharge. One of my earliest memories of being informed about racism and anti-Semitism, because I was raised Jewish, was my grandfather's experience during the war with an anti-Semitic sergeant, and rendered him difficult because he was visionary. He wanted to put turrets on dirigibles. He thought that would be great, which really wasn't that far off if you fast forward a couple of decades.
Absolutely, yes.
But in any case, he received a dishonorable discharge, and when I was 11, he spoke on his own behalf at the Pentagon. We went down to D.C., and he overturned his own dishonorable discharge.
Wow. That is a story in and of itself.
So he taught me a lot about tenacity and about equity and parity. He was very instrumental in social justice in the 60s. We had every religious leader in our home.
That's what I wanted to talk to you about.
Yes.
Tell me about the community that your family embraced. What did your community look like as you were growing up?
We were very lucky, Jim. Growing up in Bloomfield, it was an all-American city. It was back in the 60s. I was born in '56, proud of it. And
Hey, 56.
good year. But in any case, Bloomfield was amazing. It was an all-American city. We all were living in Levittown kinds of neighborhoods. It was black, it was white, it was Latino, it was every flavor of humanity imaginable, and we learned to understand the differences between us. It was a lot of sense of community. We had an Irish immigrant family, I remember this vividly, coming into our school, and everybody chipped in with whatever little they had, because we were not a wealthy neighborhood.
Yes, yes.
But to make them welcome and make them accommodated. And we had Jehovah's Witnesses that couldn't be in at our class parties, but there was a tremendous amount of tolerance and a tremendous amount of understanding for difference, for otherness.
So you grew up in that extremely diverse environment.
Very much so.
Wow.
It was great. It was very enlightening and ingrained. My friends, we all talk about it. We're still friends. We all still stay in tremendous contact. And we can't understand why we've devolved to where we are today.
Yes.
It makes no sense to us.
Yes, yes, I completely understand that. What values did you get? What values were you taught early on?
I think the values, and I always kid around about it, but laugh at yourself before someone else has the chance to. I think everybody becomes so involved with themselves. They're so interior in their lives instead of exterior. It's not a race. It's not
about you.
It's not about you, and it's not about competition. If you're in competition with other people, you haven't examined your own interior values, and we're always a work in progress. It's all chapters of our lives. It's not where you're going to end up. It's where you're going along. You don't take the express lane. You take the side roads.
Yes.
And then it's wonderful.
Yeah. Laugh at yourself. That was an important value you got early on.
From my grandfather.
From your grandfather.
He always said that. I mean, I was different. My parents were divorced. My mother was an interior designer. Pardon me. She was a professional woman. Different than the other kids. My mom wasn't home making cookies. She was designing, high-rise buildings at that time and dressed to kill back then. And it was a different way. I didn't have a father. And otherness is never embraced no matter where you are, in the most encouraging environments. So there were times where I felt different. And instead of pretending it didn't exist, I laughed about it and made it real, which was great.
Has that trait served you well throughout your life?
It has. I think
the ability to laugh at yourself? Yes.
Or laugh at situations and look at situations from outside of myself. I think it's really, really important. But just circling back, if I might, to my grammar school era.
Please.
My father was very difficult. He took us through court. I was in the family court for many, many years. And there was always a threat because laws back then were not what they are now, protecting children. And there was always a possibility that he could kidnap me, which was a very real threat. And there were court-appointed officers coming to the school periodically. And I still remember this, my friends do too. I had bodyguards, all these little boys on campus. And they're some pretty prominent people in the community that are still, that see me say, remember when I was your bodyguard, Lord?
Protecting Laurencia.
Protecting Laurencia. And they still laugh about that.
As a youngster, did you have role models other than your grandfather?
I always wanted to be a journalist.
Okay.
I really did. I wanted to do something that was larger than myself from a very early age because I understood the impermeability of life. Because of the things I went through as a kid, I also wanted justice because kids were voiceless back then, even more so than they are now. If you were going through custody battles or you were going through situations that were difficult, kids they were invisible. It was very different. So I wanted to be sure other kids had voices and people in general. So being able to write and to appreciate language from a very early age made a huge difference. It was a way it was a way to express my feelings, and I was able to read. The best part was...
That's what I was going to ask you. What did you read as a child?
Great story. I learned to read, and we don't know how. I was an only child. I learned to read. By the time I was in kindergarten, I showed up reading. They couldn't figure it out. And my dear friend Cliff Hyatt, who passed away, we love you, Cliff. Cliff was in the same grade I was, and we found out that we both could read. And our poor mothers, who were both the only professional people and women in the school, were losing their minds. They were apoplectic, wondering what's wrong with our kids that they have to go to the reading teacher. Well, the reading teacher turned out to be this great guy who my mother had bought a Nash Rambler from that previous summer. So I was like, I know who you are. And turned out Cliff and I could read, and they put us in this reading group we called the Jets, and we were left to our own devices for about a month, reading every book all the way through 6th grade.
Any book jumps out at you that you remember as a...
I was reading, true story, I was reading Anna Karenina. Yeah.
At what age?
Probably the 2nd grade, 3rd grade. I didn't know what the hell it was, but it was really good.
Wow.
Yeah, I read a lot.
That is amazing. Wow. You know, you graduated from UConn in 2015. We're jumping ahead here.
Very far ahead.
How did your education alter your thinking about the world? And talk about other educational...
Oh, exactly. Very much so. My education was very storied and varied, and I think this is very important.
Okay.
I went from Bloomfield Grammar School, and I had a teacher, Mrs. Degnan, who was our grammar school teacher, who decided that I should be in private school. And a little kid from Bloomfield, Connecticut, in a little tiny ranch that was too small for us to begin with. I knew nothing about privilege. I knew nothing about what otherness was on the other level, you know, what privilege was. And I went to Renbrook for 2 years, and Renbrook was a very elite school back in the day, back in the late 60s. It was very exclusionary. There was 1 or 2 token people of color. There were very few Jews, and the ones that were there were very wealthy. That really was a very difficult time for me. I was in court quite a bit with my father, and during those 2 years, it was 7th and 8th grade, which is a tough time to begin with, but to assimilate and find a way to navigate that whole world behind the velvet rope was a very, I think it was one of the most difficult times of my life, but also the most informative times of my life, to see that privilege is not really such a favor, necessarily.
How do you mean that privilege is really not?
I was exposed to these magnificent homes, these wealthy children that were going to the islands on the holidays while I was, babysitting.
Yes.
And a lot of them were really unhappy. Their parents were splitting left and right. There was conflict. They were doing drugs at an early age. They were drinking in 7th and 8th grade. Yeah. It was eye-opening that they really didn't know how to navigate the world any better than I did, and sometimes to a lesser degree. But that was a lesson up to me that I never, after that, and I was in school with some pretty influential kids that came from very powerful families, politically and socially. And the interesting thing was, at that point, I was never impressed with anything for the rest of my life, materially or status. And in fact, I often step back from people like that. I like regular people that are approachable, that say what they mean what they say. Mm-hmm. And I'm a Hartford kid. I can't help myself. It's served me well. And from there, though, one of the best experiences of my life, the best year, was a year at the Westledge School. It's been written up. It was a short-lived, incredible burst of creativity for a lot of kids. Colin McEnroe talks about it quite a bit on the show. Dan Hinks, who was with Xfinity Music Hall, he was one of my classmates. Amazing kids. But that school was the antithesis of Renbrook. It thrived on equity. For every kid that was a paying student was the most abjectly poor, underprivileged kid from the north end of Hartford. The bus went from one extreme to the other. You'd go through the most beautiful neighborhoods down to the projects to pick kids up. And we got along, and we learned about art, and we learned about music, and it was set in the outdoors in West Simsbury. And we were taught social justice, environmentalism, and hiking, and Outward Bound. And we were masters of our own responsibility. Our educations were negotiated that year. We could go to class if we elected to, but we understood the consequences if we didn't. And there was a lot of music that came out of there, a lot of gifted kids that came out of there.
Yes.
And we're still all in touch.
That Renbrook experience, looking back at it, would you erase it from your life if you could, or would you go through the same thing again because of what it did and what it taught you?
I think I have a Buddhist construct about a lot of things. I was brought up polytheistic, really. And from a Buddhist construct, it's beauty from ashes, mud for the lotus. That period of time informed me. It was a trial. It was a trial of faith. It was a trial of ethics in a time when I was really shaping who I was. And things were very difficult at home at that point. My grandmother, she dropped dead on Palm Sunday morning, and I found her, and I had to call the police.
Wow.
So it was a big deal. So those were those moments that, and I think throughout my life, I've been tested in these big chunks. And they either thwart you or they move you forward.
Tell me about your time in UConn. What happened out there?
Oh, UConn. Well, I went to school after they didn't know what to do with me at Bloomfield. I went to Renbrook. Westledge came back to Bloomfield High School.
They didn't know what to do with me.
And it's not uncommon. That happens a lot for me, but that's okay. But in any case, I negotiated. I was dating the principal's son.
Okay.
And Mr. Chavone said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I'll make a deal with you." I said, "I've been taking classes at University of Hartford." I said, "Can I go to college?" He said, "They'll take you." I said, "Good. It's been really nice here." My sophomore year, I went full-time at Bloomfield High. Junior year, I went half-time. I skipped my senior year. You don't do that at that age. You know nothing. 16-year-olds do not belong in college. But I was at University of Hartford. I was writing term papers for the freshmen and getting paid for it on the side. And that was all well and good. But no, it was way beyond my design limitations for that age. So that didn't work out, and I went to work at a radio station instead. And I was doing freelance copyright. I worked at WXLS Radio, which is part of WKND in Hartford, and was a copywriter there, and that was a whole adventure. I had a lot of little adventures in between, and I wrote for The Advocate. And then I decided to go back to college, and was at Hartford College for Women, finished up there, which is now part of University of Hartford, which was a wonderful experience. And then I met my ex-husband, and I took a really sharp left turn and wound up following my mother's footsteps, which is what none of us want to do, but a lot of us inevitably do.
Yes.
Kicking and screaming, but oh yeah, I do have talent in that area. And I went to the Pear College of Art for Interior Design.
Okay.
And really did well. And
where is the Pear College of Art?
Pear is in Hamden, Connecticut. And after that was a very long chapter in the design industry, the building construction industry. I had a very long and storied career. I worked for a company called Design Tex, and in the textile area and fiber. I'm a knitter, I'm a weaver. So it all dovetails. It does, all the fibers come together. And I was working on major projects with architects and designers after I finished Pear, and loved every minute of it. It was wonderful.
Now, the people you gave me to talk to prior to this interview told me that out at UConn, you were somewhat of a very special figure that a lot of the younger students out there followed you around, and that you inspired people.
You know, what happened was, well, fast forward, after all the years in the industry, I was married in 1981, and my marriage started hitting the breakdown lane in the early teens of 2010, 2011, and my mother died in 2012, and I made a decision that I always wanted to be a writer. I'm going to go back to my true north. And I took a course at Grub Street in Boston, And then I decided to go to UConn, and I did it in stages. First, I went to Avery Point, which was a wonderful experience there because it was small. I'm a process-driven person as opposed to jumping headfirst into things to see if it works. How does it work? Where are the limits? And I did. And I met one of my best pals, Edwin De Leon. Edwin, shout out to you, baby. And he's still my friend. He's half my age, but I talk to him several times a day. He's a visionary unto himself. But that's when it began. When you were asked to answer your question, I met Edwin, and then I transferred to stores, and I was taking African American Studies class, and these kids came up to me and said, there was a woman from Kazakhstan, Gulzat, and she said, they started calling me Lulu. I don't know why, but they said, Lulu, would you hang out with us? And the rest was history. For 2 years, I was hanging out with them, and then commuting to my little beautiful room at the Cora Needham House. I was living in a bed and breakfast with a retired PhD, Maggie Ulrey, and that was her home. So I had an amazing time, and I was with the kids, and when the weather was bad, I'd stay in their dorms. But one of the most seminal moments that I was there was two exchange students came up to me and they said, "Are you Lulu?" I said, "I am," because I always wore my leather fedora and a motorcycle jacket.
Yes.
And they said, "Lulu, tell us they said if we could find you, you'll tell us something we're not going to learn here." And in all seriousness, and I believe this, it's not what you do for the rest of your life, it's what you do next. And all the nexts become who you are, and there's always more nexts.
To what do you attribute your ability to connect with people? Because the people you gave me to talk to almost unanimously talked about that aspect of you. How is it you have this gift? Do you realize you have it, or?
I think I don't think it's conscious. My personality is not conscious. It's not contrived. And the thing is, being an only child from a broken home,
yes,
I had a fertile imagination. I still climb trees. I always climb trees with books. I wrote stories early on, and only children crave connection. So I have a natural curiosity about real people, because your invisible friends get really boring after a while.
You made the statement, writing saved me.
It did.
What does that mean?
I think over the years, being able to having a strong verbal IQ, which I found out what it was, and we'll never disclose that number, but it validated that truth. I was always able to write my feelings. I would always work things out on paper. And if there was a question or a piece, any injustice or something that mattered, I'd get it published. I had this ability to get things done, and I still do. But writing did save me, because I believe it was something that always was precious to me. It was something I always felt that if my identity was in question, I was in a pivotal time of change, I can always be a writer. That was my one true north, that I know my words matter, that I know my ability to communicate on paper and with other people matter. It will matter long after I'm off this planet.
Words live long after we're gone, don't they?
We hope so. It's not this. We're just, carbon dated matter, but if we leave an impression, like on those kids that came over and said, "We need to talk to you," I did something. You're doing something right.
So we know that the young people learned from you. What did you learn from them?
Oh, lots. Oh my God, I learned how that I'm a perennial, and to not take myself seriously, even more so, and that you can do whatever you want to do with them. And that what have I learned? I learned that I'm incredibly relevant to people, that it doesn't matter how old they are. And it's really, I think it's reified my sense of self, that I'm this entity as opposed to someone that has any kind of timestamp on them.
All right. Listen, that's all the time we have for part one of this marvelous interview with Miss Laurencia Ciprus. Please stay tuned for part two. This is What's Your Story? I am your host, James Ransom Reed Jr. Everybody has a story. What's yours? Until next time, good night.
Riverview Apartments is Bristol's two-time beautification award-winning residence community for adults age 55 and older. They offer 1 or 2 bedroom apartments with modern appliances, air conditioning, wall-to-wall carpet, and tiled floors. Both heat and hot water are included. Riverview also offers a wide range of activity rooms that include a billiard parlor and a spacious community room. It is handicap accessible with safe, secure parking for tenants and ample off-street parking for visitors. 860-940-6757 or riverviewbristol.com.